Okay, we're going to get started. I have the pleasure of introducing the last session for the afternoon. But before we get started, I want everybody to give Davida, Stephanie, and team an awesome round of applause for this conference. It's been wonderful. Okay, the last session is the intersectionality of tech, media, and academia. Davida asked me to introduce this panel because I have a unique background that sort of fits into all of this. I'm director of IT at NBC Universal Studios Hollywood, the entertainment capital of LA. So, with that said, with my background in tech, my background working at one of the largest entertainment media companies in LA, that sort of crosses over with what we have for tech and what we have for media. Now the other thing is, in addition to doing all that, I'm working on my doctorate in organizational leadership, and the subject matter for my dissertation is success factors that influence Black female STEM degree attainment. So with this panel and everything we've talked about, diversity and everything, everything that's going on with tech and media right now, and the talk about diversity, STEM, underrepresented minorities, it all starts with research. And in 2012, one of the key research pieces was the president's Engaged to Excel, which really brought out the need for diversity in the industry. So it all starts with research, it all starts with academia, which is how we're going to tie tech, media, and academia together to basically lay a foundation for everything we've talked about today. So with that said, Davida is going to introduce the panel. We're going to get started. Again, Davida, fabulous, awesome conference.
Am I on? Okay, we had a lot of help. We talked earlier about building a network, and we have a strong network, and we could not have done it without the strong network that we have. It gives me great pleasure to welcome this group of panelists up here today to talk about the intersection of media, tech, and academia. Each of them are very skilled and experts in their areas. They have been doing just awesome revolutionary types of things in their businesses and their organizations, and we're going to get a little bit in that today. I'm going to introduce who they are, and then they're going to talk a little bit about themselves. So on the end, we have Eytan Elbaz. He is an entrepreneur. He is the founder of Scopely, a mobile gaming company. He's also the founder of Render Media. He also, if you didn't know, he also founded the first Google AdSense. So if you know what Google AdSense is, he is the originator of that, of the technology of that. And Chris Mack, next to him, is the vice president at Warner Brothers Entertainment. He heads the Writers and Directors Workshop. Next to him is Dean Murthy. She is the Dean of Engineering here at UCLA. She's the first female dean that UCLA has ever had. And for those of you who are Bruins or either work here or have gone to school here, there's an amazing article about her, about the conference, and also just about her being the first female dean of engineering. Then there is Megan Halpern. Megan is with the Blacklist. She's a director of marketing and events and partnerships, and you should hear some of the things that she's doing in her organization, which you actually will hear today. And I'll give her a chance to introduce herself and the things that they're doing. And then to my right is Kate Lehman. Kate is currently a project manager here at UCLA. She is doing research in the area of, it's called BRAIDS, BRAID Research, Building, Recruiting, and Inclusion for Diversity. So she is our PhD, the metrics and all the research and the books. She's our person who could tell us all of that stuff today. So thank you. And for each of you, just please go ahead and just give a little bit of background about what you're doing here, doing in your organizations, and we'll get started with some of our questions, starting with Eytan.
Hi, great, this thing is on. I'm Eytan Elbaz. I was an engineer here about 20 years ago and got on to start a couple of companies, a few companies, currently working on Render Media, which is a publishing company, and also co-founded another company called Social Native out in Beverly Hills, creating branded content at scale. Just generally love starting new companies. I'd started Scopely, which is now the second fastest growing company in the United States. We make mobile games, but sometimes I guess when we get to a size, I just really like starting at that founding team, that starting culture, and that starting product. And so as companies grow, as Jonah was talking about earlier, sometimes the founders spread their wings and get to go and start a new culture and a new set of products, new set of vision, new family, new team members. So thank you.
I'm Chris Mack, and I run the Warner Brothers workshop, television workshop, which has a writer's workshop and a director's workshop and some development components. And we basically like to call it the farm team of talent for the studio. So I get to go out and find talent that hasn't quite made it to mainstream Hollywood and introduce them to our executives in the hopes to get their career started, whether it's a writer or director, and even develop some new ideas. What I love about that is we get the artists before they're all jaded and rich and making millions of dollars. Because I'm diverse, I have an eye towards diversity, and we're finding some really interesting talent out there with unique perspectives and different voices that we hope to bring to the studio and amplify their voices for the masses.
Well, I'm Jayathi Murthy. I'm Dean of Engineering here at UCLA. I've been here for 7 months now. So I'm a mechanical engineer by training, and I come to my job really from a mixture of backgrounds. So I spent the first third of my career with a small startup that actually did pretty well, a software startup, and then left that to come back to academics and have done research in a variety of areas, nanoscale heat transfer, for the last few years. And now the school itself is embarking on an extraordinarily exciting time. So we're going to be growing. So we are 170-ish faculty right now, and we'll be adding another 50 on top of that, and there'll be another 50 retiring. So the school's entirely reconstituting itself. So I'm very excited about changing the school in all kinds of ways, diversity-related, research-related, teaching-related, and so on.
I'm Megan Halpern. I'm the Director of Events and Partnerships at the Blacklist. As Davida says, there's a very small team of us, so we all do a lot. I came to the Blacklist and Entertainment from book publishing, which has the opposite problem of tech. I joke that it's 99% women, but I think it's something like 85%. And as a woman coming into entertainment, it was a shock to see the discrepancy between men and women. So what I do at the Blacklist, for those of you who don't know, started as an annual survey of the most liked unproduced scripts in Hollywood about 12 years ago, and we've since become a database that connects screenwriters of all levels in and outside of Los Angeles to filmmakers. And part of how we do that is we run a lot of programs and labs and events that discover talent and kind of partner them with large production companies or studios. We have a blind script deal with Warner Brothers, and we've worked with Sony and other major festivals and production companies. So that is what I do.
And I'm Kate Layman. I am a PhD candidate here at UCLA in higher education and organizational change, which means that I study colleges and universities themselves. And the research that I do, it focuses pretty much exclusively on gender and racial ethnic gaps in STEM fields, particularly in computer science. So right now I have the privilege of being the project manager for the BRAID project, which Davida mentioned is an acronym because we love those in academia. It stands for Building, Recruiting, and Inclusion for Diversity. And the BRAID project is a nationwide effort to bring more women and people of color into computer science departments. It's the brainchild of Telly Whitney, who's the CEO of the Anita Borg Institute up in the Bay Area, and Maria Clave, who's the president of Harvey Mudd College, and has been in the news a lot because they have graduated more women in computer science than men this past year. And so they came together and came up with this idea to give 15 computer science departments around the US some money to diversify their departments. And then they brought my advisor, Linda Sachs, who's a professor of education, and me, on to design a study to follow up and see how well this works. So that's what I do.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. So today, just as we said, we're going to talk a little bit about things like images. What's the relationship between what you see and what you think you can become, and which is hence our entertainment folks on the panel. And we're also going to get into some statistics of not just the pipeline. So we are going to talk a little bit about and see a little bit more on statistics with the computer science students, but also too, we're going to kind of map that to what's happening in film and media, and are we really producing and providing the right images for young girls and also to women in their careers, to be able to look and see someone who is headed in the same direction that they want to head, and to continue in tech or in STEM fields that and to help close that gender gap. So let's see. Okay, so Kate's going to start us off with some statistics, and which is going to be very interesting, just about self-image, and I'll let you describe your she's way smarter than I am.
Oh, that is so not true. So I'm going to share some of our findings from the BRAID project, as well as some of the findings from the study that Linda and I did prior to this, which was an NSF-funded study that was looking at the predictors that led men and women into STEM fields in college. So first I want to show you, I'm going to stand because I can't see the slides. Yep. Oh, wait, mic. All right. See, I don't do this often. So what this slide is showing you is the proportion of incoming students who plan to major in STEM fields in the aggregate. And when I'm talking about STEM fields today, I'm talking about mathematics, physics, biological sciences, what did I not say? Computer science, engineering, did I say math? But the point is not social sciences, which sometimes gets included in this definition. And you'll see that in the mid-70s, about 32% of men, when they started college, said that they were interested in majoring in STEM, compared to about 13% of women. And then in 2011, you'll see that about 37% of men coming to college said they planned to major in any STEM field, whereas about 20% of women did. And so, I mean, what that tells you is that, in general, more students are interested in STEM now than they were in the past. More men still than women, but the gender gap has closed somewhat. However, it really matters if you're, like when you look at different STEM fields. When you aggregate them all together, biology is by far the largest STEM discipline, and it's very unique. If you look, it's the very last bar on that slide, and if you can't see it, it says that 58% of students coming to college planning to major in biology are women. So they sort of have a reverse gender gap. So when you look at STEM in the aggregate, you're really washing out the story, because if you look at the other end of the slide, you see that in engineering and computer science, only about 17 or 18% of the students who come in those majors are women. So that's why my work focuses so intentionally on those two disciplines. And so now I will turn to the next slide. So Linda and I got really interested in what's going on in computer science specifically. And so we started looking at what are the traits of men and women who come in to the computing field. And what we found is a really interesting story. And the headline of it is, women in computer science rank themselves the lowest of all students in all things, almost. So it's kind of it's not necessarily the most encouraging story, but the good news is that when we know that this is the case, we can do something about it. And so this first slide here is showing you how students rate themselves in terms of their academic ability. And so what you see here is that women in computer science rate themselves lower than women in any other STEM discipline, and only slightly higher than all college students in general, which is maybe counterintuitive because you probably have a stereotype in your head that computer science students are super smart, but they don't necessarily think of themselves that way, particularly women. Similarly, with intellectual self-confidence, women in computer science, not only do they rate themselves lower than all the other women in other STEM fields, they're lower than all students in terms of how their confidence about their intellectual ability. In terms of leadership, again, women in CS are rating themselves the lowest among STEM fields and all students, although the gap here is much smaller. So still, approximately 50% of them say that they're in the highest 10% of having leadership abilities. So in general, college students think they're really good leaders, is kind of the point. And then in emotional health, again, we see that women in CS are lower than all students or any other STEM field. And so Linda and I look at lots of these different types of variables and try to get a sense of who are college students, how do they see themselves, and in particular, how are men and women different? In this particular study, we were not focused as much on race and ethnicity, but in our current project, we're focusing more on that. So one piece of great news that we discovered is that the one thing that women in CS are way higher on than women in general or women in other STEM fields is artistic ability. And while it's true for women in CS, it's not true for men. So I think this really plays into that narrative that we're hearing now, that we need to articulate the different ways in which you can use technology to accomplish creative things. That message may be landing because it seems like we're attracting more women with that artistic talent. So from our new project, we are focused on computer science in particular. We're looking at both gender and race. And we're really trying to understand, when we get a student in college into an introductory computer science course, what happens? How do we retain them in the computer science major? What are they experiencing in those intro courses? And who are students who sign up for intro CS courses? Because colleges around the country are seeing a huge growth in enrollment in those classes, and not all of those students are going to end up being computer science majors, but they will at least have had this exposure. So we're trying to learn more about those students. So this has been previously found in the literature, but we're finding it to be true in our study, is that women coming into these intro courses predominantly have very little background in computer programming or computer science, whereas most of the men have some sort of experience. So in our first year of data collection, we found that I believe it's like 41% of the men had taken a computer programming class in high school, so there's like 40% of the men who have this very specific experience, whereas almost 40% of the women have absolutely no programming experience. And I think that that difference is really important in understanding why we're seeing such a huge gap in the pipeline. So another thing we're really paying attention to is women and men and people of color's sense of belonging in the tech field. And so we're just in the preliminary phases of this analysis, but we started looking at how men and women and students from majority groups and students from underrepresented groups feel that sense of belonging. So what we found is that majority women and minority women have lower sense of belonging in computer science than either majority men or minority men, which isn't really that surprising. But we're looking forward to exploring that more closely and trying to get a sense of what happens in college. We get students in these CS intro courses. How do we keep them? How do we start building a stronger connection for women and women of color in tech? So that's my stuff.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, so that talks about really the pipeline, the students part of it. And we're going to take a look at a few more stats where media is concerned. So I'm actually going to stand up too because I can't see. So the Gina Davis Institute on Women in Media does reports. They do a lot of research on really the role of women in films and what that actually looks like. And these are some very interesting results of the report. The first thing is that when you're talking about characters by gender, the number of speaking roles, so speaking roles is a very important thing, of course, if you are in a film, but the majority of them are given to men, so 70.7% of the speaking roles are men, and the remainder are women. The number of characters holding jobs, so the characters, most of the females in these films are not actually holding jobs. So, really, what kind of image is that really displaying to people? And the number of characters in C-suite. For men, 86.1% of the characters that are in these films are men, and 13.9% are female. And one of the things just that they reported was that if you have more female filmmakers, you will have stronger roles for women and women in other types of roles, more leadership roles, that will actually help to give a better image of women in film. Some other interesting statistics in terms of characters working in STEM jobs. The number of characters working in identifiable STEM jobs was 87.5% were men, and the remainder, which was 12.5%, are women. In computer science in particular and in engineering, those are disparities as well. So the male characters, 82.8%, 17.2% female, engineering 91.1%, and 8.9% were female. And so, we're seeing a lot of disparities just even in film on how those roles are being attributed to women. And we're going to start there. And I wanted to really direct this to the first couple of questions to Chris and Megan, because they are both working in entertainment. And I want you to talk a little bit about the diversity challenge that you experience within your own industry and the work that you're doing in your projects, and just how this kind of overlays to what you're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, I could just want to start with like a personal experience myself in terms of images on television. I remember growing up, in front of the television. I was a latchkey kid. And I remember seeing this movie with Denzel Washington and Richard Gere called Power. And Denzel Washington played his, antagonist. But it was the first time I'd seen a black man in a suit who was a bad guy, but who was like elegant and articulate and smart. And just the night before, I had seen Huggy Bear, And so it was a revelation to me that, oh wow, I can be like that, And so I think images are really important. The images that we do put on television are important. And so to bring it to where we are now, what I've found is, I'm involved with this, this digital initiative where we're hiring, a lot of female filmmakers and filmmakers of color. When you put those people in positions of power, and when they're doing the hiring, they tend to hire people that are like them. And so we see that our crews have more women. I was just on a set today that had over 60% women in staffed up his crew. A DIT person who's in charge of the digital and the digital image that's directed towards post. I'd never seen a woman in that position before, and she was in her late 20s. And so they also tend to try and hire female editors or DPs or ADs. And these are the positions that usually lead towards directing opportunities. So that's a good way to create a talent pool there. And I think Shonda Rhimes is a perfect example of someone who has created an empire, and she's made sure that she's hired women and people of color who are talented and deserve the job, but she's making an effort to do that. So I think it's important. It becomes this virtuous cycle. We talk about it at the studio, because the audience is drastically changing. Everybody knows that by 2042, the audience is going to be more diverse than it ever is, and so we have to create content that represents that. So you have an audience that's very diverse, so you need artists that are very diverse, and the people hiring the artists also have to be diverse. So we're not, I think Jonah was talking about it. So we're not trying to make a leap in terms of who we have to hire. We just do it because we feel it's the right thing to do. So I think it's just something that we're talking about, in the business, at our company, at all companies, and I think it's actually something that is going to happen, whereas I got into this business 20 years ago, and the only time we would talk about diversity is when an urban film would open big, the $20 million, $100 million or whatever. But now we're realizing that, we need to make a change because the audience is demanding it.
Yep, awesome.
One of the things that we bump up against a lot is we hear that there's a problem with the pool, right? That there's not enough talented women to hire, there's not enough talented minority writers to hire, and on our website, we've run a lot of data for the scripts that are posted, and statistically speaking, from our pool, which I think currently we have 3,500 scripts hosted in the database, and that's just at this very moment, men and women score on the same range. So there are, and across genre as well. And there might be, you know, many, many more men writing, but the talent level is the same. But I think we hear that a lot moving up the chain, is that agents aren't representing those folks. And then when showrunners, even when they're intentionally trying to hire those folks, can't find them. So that's something that we're really trying to do. And it really affects everything. I mean, women tend to write women characters, just as men tend to write male characters. We've also run these numbers with the scripts on our site. And it infiltrates the system. You know, we do other things besides these educational programs. We do dinners for working writers, which is always a struggle, even with our invitation list, you know, trying to keep it as diverse as possible and a pretty even split between working women writers and working male writers. We do live reads of scripts that have been on our annual Blacklist, and there's always, we're always searching for the content so that we can have an equal number of men and women on stage, and also a third minority actors. And it is a constant struggle that we actually end up taking scripts that are written for all white, mostly male casts, and gender flipping, and hiring actors completely colorblind, because otherwise the content just isn't out there. But the more writer, like as Chris was saying, the more writers and the more behind the scenes people you have in the room that are representing those backgrounds, the more likely you are to have those people on screen. So it really does start at the base.
Absolutely. And Dean Murthy, I know you've been here 7 months and probably very much immersed into the culture of UCLA and engineering. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the things that you're looking at doing within the engineering program in terms of bringing more females into the program?
Right, so yeah, I have been here only 7 months, but engineering schools are surprisingly similar, and engineering state schools are surprisingly similar. So you run into the same kinds of things everywhere. Just to start you off, so our numbers are 23% female in the undergraduate program, pretty close to that in the graduate program, 22% in the graduate program, and our faculty are 15% female, right? Now, those numbers are comparable to what you would see in Michigan or Illinois or Berkeley. I mean, they're not different, and we're all not high enough. I mean, we're all pretty low. At UCLA, we don't currently have a women in engineering program, which some of our larger schools, in fact, do. And so I'm in the process of pulling all of that together, and you should see that kicking off in about 5 to 6 months. What does a women in engineering program do? My thinking really is that it needs to cut across the entire pipeline. So I don't have the wherewithal to get into middle school, but starting from the pipeline into engineering, to look at admissions, to look at retention, graduation rates, and ultimately actually employment and persistence in employment is a very big part of this. So I'm kind of hoping that I can pull this entire pipeline together here in Southern California to create an ecosystem where these folks can see each other, watch each other succeed, help each other out. And so that's what we're in the process of kicking out. So my hope is in the next 5-ish years, we'll get to about a third across the board at a minimum for all of these categories. I've done some of that in the past at UT Austin. We were actually quite successful in moving the numbers, and I'm hoping we can do that here. This year, we've had a terrific hiring season. We're about 33% women in our faculty hiring this year. So that's what we're trying to do.
That's great. And even with that, just being an undergraduate at MIT in computer science, there weren't a lot of female role models or even professors. I don't even remember one. And so those are the types of things that are very important to have within while you're matriculating, because those role models do make a difference in what you see yourself as and what you think that you can become. And Eytan, I wanted to ask you, you are I don't know if you consider yourself a serial entrepreneur, but you have had several successful startups. And, we heard from Jonah earlier about just the culture of startups, that you hire fast, you're, on the grind. how do you reflect diversity within your startup culture?
So, these statistics are eye-opening. When you see them all put together, it's clear there's issues that need to get addressed. And to be perfectly honest, small business, small startup, you don't give it that much thought. What we do give thought to is meritocracy and making sure that good people end up in the right positions. And proudly I can say that as I look across the two companies I started in the last couple of years here, our chief operating officer who's here today, Rachel Bullock, who spoke earlier, most of the company reports into her. And I thought as we went through these questions, I was thinking about the last 3 promotions we had at our company, and 2 of the 3 went to women. One of them is here, Hillary Miller. Our company is roughly 50-50. We do have a female running QA. We have a female in the engineering department. And so, this is just one small slice. It's one small 32-person company, but that's what I can do there. And then at Social Native, we are, and I hadn't thought about it, but we're essentially 3 white guys who started a company. And I hadn't really thought about it, but we ended up, our next 2 hires for the senior management team were both female. And honestly, I didn't really think about the 3 of us starting the company, and I didn't think about the fact that these 2 females that we hired for general manager, who essentially most of the company is now reporting to her, and a vice president of marketing. And ultimately, if you have a founding team who is focused on meritocracy, hopefully cultures and companies can emerge where we won't have to put in place programs to promote people who aren't getting rightfully represented.
That's great. That's great. So let's talk a little bit about partnerships. Megan, I know both you and Chris actually have partnered with Google. You have really advisors on some things. And how do you feel that those partnerships play a role in the things that you do? And if you're not aware, Blacklist recently did a partnership with Google where they were looking for scripts for TV and scripts in film that had STEM characters in them. And so what a great partnership. I mean, Google is advising you, you're partnering together to bring tech and media together. So talk a little bit about the partnerships that you have and how they basically kind of keep you honest on some things.
Yeah, I mean, diversity and women in entertainment is really important to the Blacklist in general. We're an incredibly diverse company. There's only 6 of us. We're 50% women, 50% diverse, and we have 2 engineers and one of them is a woman. So it's kind of something that we think about all the time. We try and be hyper vigilant about things like this, and in every decision, keep it in mind as something we do. So a lot of our partnerships are diversity driven and women driven. So our Google partnership is actually funding 3 separate writers to write 1 feature and then 2 episodic pilot writers to write their scripts with a STEM main character, and Google is funding 6 months of work for them to be able to do that. Obviously, writing a script on spec doesn't always pay the bills, so it's an incredible thing to have as a writer. We do a lot in this. I mean, our partnership with Warner Brothers is a blind 2-step deal, which is kind of like a minimum Writers Guild deal, and that's to identify a diverse writer that Warner Brothers will then select from a group that we give them to employ them for a year. And we've done the same thing with Disney. And we run 2 labs every year that are specifically female-driven. So one is a female episodic lab, and that actually starts next week. We are bringing 8 female TV writers together for 8 weeks of training, and we do the same thing with, last year it was 4 women feature writers, and hopefully we'll do the same thing with more writers this coming year. So those are just some of our partnerships that are open right now, but we're really about empowering women and minorities in the industry and giving them the tools and the connections and the mentorships to succeed.
Yeah, so we don't really have an official partnership with Google, but we've had conversations about making sure our writers' rooms are aware of the need to represent more women in STEM jobs, and So we've had, invitations for our writers' rooms to go up to the Google camp and, check that out, and they've been very excited about that. We also, we've also partnered with the DGA. I think all the studios and networks and production companies in town have partnered with the DGA to basically agree to create fellowships or programs within their companies that will help identify and hire more women and directors of color. And that's how the Directors Workshop, the genesis of the Directors Workshop. And what we try to do is we try to make sure that, again, we look for directors that are, hired based on their talent. So you just don't get to come in just because you're a woman or a director of color. And we run a class, a 7-week class that's taught by Bethany Rooney that basically teaches the directors, how to direct television from prep to post. And these directors are very, I don't want to say established, but they're very skilled directors. They've had a long career in directing music videos or commercials or even independent films. But television is a little bit of a different beast in that, we have to produce these things in a couple of weeks. And if someone screws it up, then it just kind of, messes with our whole timeline, our production schedule. So we do that, and we when you get into the program, you have a job waiting for you on one of our productions, after you meet with the producers and the showrunners. And we've been pretty successful doing that. I think it will help move the needle. I don't think it's enough. I like to say what we're trying to do is boil the ocean. And I think, we talk about diversity in terms of the 3 Ps. You have your pipeline, your pool, and parity. And I think this industry does very well with the present pool in terms of putting tens of millions of dollars of trying to identify talented, writers and directors that are, women and of color. But until we do something about the pipeline, until we give these kids who are in high school, to dare to dream or even know that there's these jobs waiting for them, in Silicon Valley or, in Hollywood, we're just not going to have enough people to fill the pool because, I think John Landgraf said by 2017 we're going to have over 500 scripted shows airing, whether it's digital or network. And so the jobs are there, and we just don't have enough women and people of color that are primed and ready to go.
Yep. That's great. And I'm going to get into actually before I get into my next question, Kate, I wanted to ask you in your research and the research that you have seen and others within your area of expertise. Is there a connection between images? I think we know that there is a connection between images and what you think you can be. And I think it was Gina Davis who said, you can't be what you can't see. And can you talk a little bit about that connection there?
Yeah, absolutely. So, certainly the intuitive sense that we all have that having, women on our engineering and computer science faculty, having women and people of color in, tech jobs on TV and film, that really matters. There's, so in our study right now, the thing that is most similar to what we're talking about is that we are specifically surveying the faculty of these introductory computer science courses as well as the students, and we're trying to bring together that data to understand if it matters if your intro course faculty member is a woman, if it matters if that is a person of color, if it matters if that person seems to be really well versed in issues of diversity in trying to address some of these ways that women in computer science specifically might be underselling themselves. And then there's, this is sort of outside our research project, but there's been a ton of research on sort of the impact of stereotypical images and stereotypical role models in computing, which has basically found that when a young woman in college encounters a classroom where there's posters that are just like the super stereotypical hacker geek dude on the wall, she becomes disinterested in computer science immediately after one exposure. Whereas if they're just pictures of like mountains and books, she's completely happy and engaged. So those images can really affect how women feel about their place in this industry. And then obviously their ability to end up in some of these jobs that we know are there waiting for them.
So, let's talk about quotas. That's to some people, it's a bad word. Some people, it's a great word. Quotas, programs. I want to really get your perspectives on being able to engage more women, more minorities in these fields where there's clearly a need for them, without, the stigma of what those programs would actually give them in a sense. So I think each of you in each of your areas, there is that sort of potential stigma where you have to hire a certain number, or you have to do a certain number, or even not have to, but you need to increase your numbers. There's a pressure to increase. There are metrics out there that are saying the numbers aren't looking good. So I want each of you actually to tell me a little bit about what your thoughts are on numbers, and also how you would go about really dealing with your increasing those numbers without that stigma, basically. Let's start with you, Eytan.
Starting with me. Quotas. Running a business, there's all kinds of pressures from different directions. You've got pressures to do things like, so we're talking today about diversity. You've got pressures to do things like pay the bills, keep the lights on. You have pressures to do things like make a product better or innovate. You have pressures to do things like recruit. And so all of these are kind of coming into a system. As you see, when a company gets bigger, gets to raise money, it gives you, I think, a moment to step back. When Jonah talked about getting to 1,000 employees, and I think when I was at Google, you'd see things like this. I think you have to put. It's a tough question. Come back to me.
Well, I just wanted to jump in and say that one of the things that we talk about all the time is not wanting to put people in a position where they're not ready to be yet, and have that be a negative reflection on them, and then the reason why they got there. So that's something we talk a lot about in terms of like kind of our women-driven and people of color diversity programs. So for us, because all of our selections are done at the baseline of an algorithm, what we like to do is we have a rating system. Once you kind of hit that threshold and make it into our finalist program, that's kind of when we start looking at those specific diversity traits. So that I think that for us, it's more important that we have, for example, a group of like very solid 4 female screenwriters to go through our lab and to be introduced to all these high-level people than it would be to have 6 and maybe 2 of them aren't ready. Because we don't want to disadvantage anyone by kind of, leveraging that that minority status. So it's something that we always keep at the front of mind, because that's not fair for the individual or for the general community either.
I understand your struggle. 'Cause, I struggle with it as well because, look, my view on quotas has evolved as I've gotten older. If you were to ask me about quotas 20 years ago, I'd be like, hell yeah, quotas, But I think, when I was asked to run the Writers' Workshop 10 years ago, they asked me to turn it into a diversity program, and I pushed back on it. And they were really flummoxed by that, because the face of diversity is like, why wouldn't you want to do that? And I was like, because writers who come out of diversity programs, and there was a big article on this not too long ago, it's a stigma. They're kind of mandated to be put on these shows, and depending on how the showrunner receives them, they can either have a very good time on the show, or they can have a very challenging time where they're looked at as the diversity hire, even though they may be totally qualified to do the job. And so my argument to them was like, hey, if we get diverse writers that come from a colorblind program, they will have more street cred out there with their writing partners on the television shows. And we feel that we do. We feel that we don't always, get 30% diversity. Sometimes I have more diverse or more women in the writers' workshop. We pick 8 people a year. Sometimes I might have more white men, but it varies. You know, we always have at least one of of each. And so I think the other thing to recognize is that quotas aren't they're not permanent within the culture of your business. So we're having a lot of conversations about, well, should we have a diversity department, or should we make hiring diverse employees as part of our DNA? Like, how do we make that part of our culture? So like when I stopped running the writers' workshop, how are we going to make sure that the next executive is going to make sure that they're trying to get a diverse pool of talent? And I think it's just kind of, for 2 things. I think for like our business as a whole, it has to be a business imperative. And I think we're starting to realize that that's why we're having all these conversations about, women and, artists of colors, because the audience is looking for more authenticity, and and so we need those artists to represent that, to, be able to create that content. So I think you'll see a difference, but I think it's more important that it's the culture and not the mandates and not the quotas that are driving the desire to hire diversity.
Awesome, thank you.
I'll finish now.
Okay, go ahead, Eytan.
You come into a conference and you start to hear statistics, and it opens your eyes even further to what you might have started. I'm building these companies, and we're building these companies. We think to a place that we won't need quotas because we're idealistic, and we think we're going to build these companies in a sense that it reflects the breakdown of gender and race without trying. But it's clear that's maybe that's not possible. And when you listen to what Jonah said earlier, that this HR person he brought in came in and learned that there was a salary discrepancy that maybe he wasn't aware of, and then later on you go and take care of that thing. And so I guess ultimately the takeaway for me is, as we grow, as this company gets bigger, and we can no longer see, and maybe things aren't as transparent as we think, maybe we need to bring people in to look a little closer and actually look at the data and potentially expose things to us that we cannot see.
Awesome.
And I'll just add one more thing. I think there's also this discussion about, maybe you know about this, is the unconscious bias
Absolutely.
that we all have. And it's kind of like, if you, again, going back to Joan, it's like if you can't, you don't get a lot of mileage mandating, diversity on your upper level executives. But if you make them aware that there is an unconscious bias there when they're making decisions, hopefully they step back, and instead of looking through this prism, they open up their eyes. Okay, let me open up my search a little bit. So.
Yeah, that's something that we've started doing, bias training, and we're going to do more of it publicly this fall too, because I think that the most significant story that stuck out for me when I did my unconscious bias training was you don't even see the things that you think you're missing. I think a few years ago there was a study that came out, and NPR did a piece on it about the orchestra auditions. Didn't even see this, and the way that they wanted to come to a 50% female, 50% male orchestra was they were like, oh, we're going to do blind auditions. We're going to put everyone behind a curtain, and then since men and women are equally talented, we'll have a 50-50 orchestra. And they did it, and it didn't work. And they were really flummoxed, and it turned out that female musicians tend to wear high heels. And they were coming out on stage, and they, like, unconsciously, the men knew that they were women because they could hear the heels. So when they did it again, they had the women go out on stage barefoot, and that they came to parody. So, I mean, it's funny what you don't know what's triggering for you in terms of bias. And the more that we talk about it, and the more that you're aware of it, I think that has a real influence on
Absolutely,
things.
it does.
So one thing that I wanted to, I know, I'm guessing we're out of time, so I'll be quick. But earlier, Eytan, you brought up the word meritocracy, and that word scares me a lot because of this idea of unconscious bias and what we deem worthy of merit. And so quotas at most universities, well, public universities in the country are illegal. So we can't have quotas to get more women in computer science. And when I work with computer science departments, they push back. They basically will often say, like, well, there's not a whole lot we can do because we can't do anything about admissions. And what I say to them is, but you can change what you give value to in the admissions process. And so you can realize that women who are coming into computer science are undervaluing their intellectual abilities, and we know that the SAT is not a perfect measure of somebody's mathematical aptitude, and some people don't even think that math is that important to computer science now. And so I think part of this is evolving what we think about as worthy of merit, and realizing that, I, as a, white woman from Ohio, I'm going to think certain characteristics are really awesome. I'm going to hire people who have those characteristics, and in that way I may be replicating my own bias. And so I think that's why it's important, like you said, to bring in other people from the outside who can help check you on those things.
Yep, absolutely. That's good. So, Dean Murthy, the head of the engineering department, you have these students and you basically have to take care of them. What are your thoughts on bringing more women into the program? I mean, you talked about the Women in Engineering program. And so what are your thoughts about quotas? I mean, have you been a part of a program to be a female engineer?
Okay, so quotas I'm pretty uncomfortable with, only because it imposes, I think, a huge baggage on the young women that are already got a whole bunch of stuff on top of them, all right? So I don't buy the idea of quotas, but I do think that there's room for feeding the pipeline in other ways. I mean, you can bring young women to the table, you can bring young faculty members to the table, and I think there's a very real role to be played in feeding that pipeline. The way you pick is a separate issue. There are, of course, issues of what you consider worthy or what you consider as a meritocracy. I think that's a very valid question to be asked. But once you've chosen your standard, I think you have to pick blindly, really. The thing that you can do is make sure that you're bringing enough young women to the table, bringing enough diversity to the table, that the picking can happen. And sometimes even that really doesn't happen, all right? So, for example, everybody in my departments knows that we're going to try and increase the percentage of women in engineering. And I will, talk to my department chairs and make sure that that's heard during the hiring process. But the answer in many places typically is, well, the pipeline doesn't exist, we tried, it didn't happen. But the truth is that's not nearly good enough. We know the top 20 departments in the country, we're going to hire from them. We know the fields that we're hiring from. We even know who the graduate students are half the time. And I know who the women graduate students are in the top departments in the country. You ought to keep track of these things and bring them in. So there is an active role that goes beyond saying, hey, the pipeline's not big enough, it didn't work. And so I'm looking for that active engagement, right? In terms of our undergraduate students, for example, all right? So in UCLA, the numbers are pretty stunning. I don't know if you guys know this. UCLA engineering gets 23,000 applicants in any given year. We take 800, all right? So it's a ridiculously selective program. And but even there, we make offers to 4 times as many young women that actually say yes to us. So there is a big unrealized pool. And these are young women who want to be engineers, who've thought of UCLA seriously enough to apply. And it's our job then to hustle and get them in here. And so there's stuff to be done. I mean, it's not really true that, without quotas it wouldn't work. That's not true. There's a bunch of work you have to do, but doing it allows the future to evolve in the ways that you want, with self-confident young women who know they're there because they deserve to be there. I think that's absolutely true.
That's awesome. And what I'm hearing too is that you really have to make that investment. You have to make it a part of your organization, and it does take work. It does take time, and those are the things. That's your commitment to ensuring that your organization is diverse. And we are running out of time, but I did want to ask if I wanted to open it up to anyone in the audience if they had questions. If you can come to the mic if you have questions, we'd like to hear from you. One. Okay.
First, I think we're looking at something in the data, and I think we're thinking the wrong thing, because I think girls are not showing up because they don't want to work in cubes. Just kidding. They're so smart, they don't want to work in the cube. That's why they're not showing up. Thinking about, I guess we influence diversity the most in our private lives. So I just wanted to make a note to make sure, as we're all sitting here, that we're checking ourselves in terms of the diversity in our own social group, because that's where the kids are growing up. So it doesn't do us a lot of good to talk about diversity in the workplace when you go home and everybody looks the same. So just wanted to throw that out there at everybody. So what are we doing with early childhood education? Because I know if you ask kindergartners, nobody wants to be in IT, right? It's like fireman, police, doctor, teacher. Nobody raises their hand to be in technology. So just curious, how are we influencing our early elementary system?
Can I say one thing to back up what you just said? So in our BRAID survey of intro course students, we asked them what their parents do. And more than 25% of students in intro courses have at least one parent who are in the tech field. That is astronomically high. When we look at national data, it's like less than 5% of all college students have a parent in the tech field. Or I don't know what the exact number, but it's not a huge number like that. That's a huge number. And so obviously what you're doing with your own kids, or the way that you might the way you educate your neighbors' kids or your nieces and nephews about tech fields, that matters. You can be the person that introduces them to this idea that they can sit at the table.
That really resonates with me too, because my mother taught me how to use a computer. And she was my role model. And when I went to high school, all of my math teachers were Black females. And so that reinforced an image that this is just what we're supposed to do. Do math, do science, and I felt very comfortable doing that. Did not feel like I was not a part of that community at all. So I think that role models really they play a strong role in what you think you can do and what you end up, really actually doing. Okay. Are there any more questions?
I'm trying to figure out how to word this. First, Eytan, I want to acknowledge you because you asked us to come back to your question, and you admitted to potentially having a new perspective or opening in the way you see things. And I think that's powerful, like even just on one panel. Chris, you said something about pipeline pool parity, and then you mentioned that the pipeline just wasn't there. It's going to sound like a challenge, but it's really just something that I think about often in tech and in media. Is the pipeline really that lacking, or is what we're looking for potentially lacking?
No, I think the pipeline is lacking. I think the problem is it's a double-edged sword, right? So there's two conversations going on. You have, let's say a white producer who's mandated to staff his writer's room with two diverse writers, right? And he's like, I've looked, but there's just not, that person doesn't exist. I can't find the two, right? And we all know that material, especially in the arts, is subjective, okay? And then on the other side, you have people of color and women going like, yeah, but they do exist because I know 20 writers that are Black who don't have jobs. But the thing is, just because you're of color, you're a woman, doesn't mean that you're as talented as we're looking for, because we're in the business of being in the top 10%, and it's been my experience that the people who are considered, very talented, no matter what color you are, there is a universal agreement, like, yes, they have what it takes, okay? So when you have a pool that is, only 13%, of the greater pool, and we have to deal with that top 10%, and you have 500 scripted shows, it's like, so the talent, that top 10% gets eaten up very quickly. So what I'm saying is we need to grow the initial pool that's coming in, exponentially, so we just have a larger, and I'm not a mathematician, but a greater 10% to choose from. So that's getting in the weeds of what I was trying to say.
Yeah, I'm on the board of the junior board of a company called the Young Storytellers here in Los Angeles, and it puts entertainment mentors into underprivileged schools where arts funding has been cut, and offers those young kids starting in elementary school 8 weeks with a mentor to write their own story, and then have script play, and then have it either shot on film or performed by real actors on stage in front of their class. And a lot of those kids were never, ever, ever told that they had a voice and that they could tell their own story, and it could be about whatever they wanted it to be. And a lot of times it's reflective of, a hard time that they're having at home or just how they perceive the world. And the program's been going on for over 15 years now. And, a lot of those kids are now in college and they're going into media fields. And I think STEM probably has an advantage over media in that case, because entertainment is kind of this world where a lot of times you have to take an unpaid internship or move to Los Angeles, and it's a really privileged situation to be able to afford that when you could go on to be a scientist or an engineer or a doctor. And so I think that for us, we've really found that encouraging young voices and bringing them up through the system really changes things in 15 years and creates that bigger pool when they end up at UCLA.
I just want to add to that quickly, because I think Kathleen did a great job talking about subconscious bias. And I definitely don't disagree with you around there being a lack of a pool. What I was really trying to get at, you answered the question before I had a chance to finish it, was I just wonder if there's an opportunity because building a pipeline starting at 5, that's going to take a long time, right? They have to become old enough. So I wonder if there's an opportunity to look at the current pool in terms of where they are now and maybe further along the pipeline, and considering subconscious bias, as well as considering maybe some gaps that may be in their training that could be easily fixed from a growth mindset perspective that could potentially increase the size of that pool more quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I think we try to do that with our, every network has a fellowship, that looks for, and we're the only one that's not diversity, doesn't have like a diverse, kind of, stamp on it. But look, they bring in writers who come in, they put them through these lecture series and stuff and teach them how to do those things. But I think one of the things that happens, and this is, was an experience of a writer friend of mine who writes on one of our Chuck Lorre shows, very young, at a very young age, he was identified as being great in math, right? And so his counselors were like, you should be an engineer, And so he's directed to being an engineer. He gets to MIT and he goes like, I hate being an engineer, That's what I do. I want to write. So instead of spending all of this formative years of writing in the arts, he spent those years, training to be an engineer, right? So now he's in his early 20s, and he's kind of starting behind those guys who started when they were like 13, right? If you believe the whole outlier thing, your 10,000 hours, you're just starting at a disadvantage, and that you can't train. That only time will heal that. Okay. So it's a complicated question.
And I think there's some,
Go ahead, Megan.
I feel like the Blacklist has tried to step into this in a little bit of a way, because there's a lot of natural talent out there for people that don't live in Los Angeles or New York, which are kind of like our entertainment capitals. And all of our scripts on our website are read blind by readers and then rated on a scale of 1 to 10, and then that feeds into our system. So I think that a lot of people who have had different career paths in life, for whatever reason, have kind of found our site and been, I don't want to say discovered because that word feels so weighted, but been kind of like offered like this different path into the industry, because they're, we have a guy who's a father of 4 and lives outside of Ohio and has spent his entire life as an architect, and wrote this really wonderful script about a black football player who was murdered at the end of his first game. And I forget what college is. I want to say it's Ohio or Cincinnati, but I'm vague on the details because I read it a couple years ago. He applied to a bunch of our programs. He went through our lab program, and he eventually had his script optioned by the company, which is the NFL's production company. And this is a man who has no formal screenplay or writing training, and spent, he's in his 60s and he lives in Ohio. And so that was kind of like his way in. And now I think he's repped at CAA. He's out here, he actually still lives in Ohio with his kids. And he's out here every few months taking meetings. So I think there is an alternate way into the industry. It's just there are a lot of closed doors, and we're just trying to open one more with this kind of blind database situation.
I've heard that a quote that says it's easier to train a child than to fix an adult. And I say that, I overlay that with, we have a system, it's systemic. It's a broken system. It's something that we have to go back and start investing time and energy into something that will be a systemic change, and not just a personal change, a person here, a person there. So it is, I think it's something that, which is why we're here today, which is looking at this as a systemic issue, and to really address the root causes of these things, And to see some of the progress that's made in other fields, such as in law and in medicine, where those were fields that were very heavily male-dominated, but that's not the case now. So I think that maybe it's LA Law, that did that. So
Doesn't Sonia Sotomayor give credit to watching LA Law or something like that as one of the reasons? She said that in an interview.
But in that connection, the views of STEM are actually extraordinarily poor on TV. I don't even mean women in STEM. STEM itself is horribly represented.
Well, it's not very exciting looking at a computer.
Right.
Well, they're also very bad people half the time. I have no idea.
Hacking. Yeah, they're always Okay, we have time for about one more question.
So a lot of people have been talking about the pipeline problem, and we just discussed a whole bunch about that. But part of, at least what I've seen, especially with my colleagues and even myself, I studied economics, but I really was considering going into physics and going into computer science, and I kind of shied away from it. And part of that I feel like is like this leaky pipeline, in that we don't have retention, and we create a lot of opportunities to go into spaces really gung-ho, but it may not actually be an environment that's welcoming or maybe even actively hostile toward women or toward people of color. And I wanted to know what in your experience and what in your organizations you're doing to make sure that the people that do come into your space do have a voice and do continue to feel welcome and feel like they have a place on the team, not just because of quotas or anything like that, but because they earned their spot.
I can say a little bit about our retention numbers. Actually, they're surprisingly good, all right? So, and that should come as a surprise given how small the numbers are. Our retention rates and graduation rates for men and women are roughly the same. There's a little bit of bumping around year to year, but they're surprisingly the same. But that doesn't happen for free, all right? It happens because you put very specific programs in place to make it happen. And we've got some really good stuff going on here. So what kind of programs? Programs focus on creating cohorts of women, and this is also true of our diverse student populations. Program cohorts where people study together, hang together as they pass through the courses and the system. They help each other out. They get to know each other. They're brought together every so often as a group. So you have to create a support system around the academics that allows people to start beginning to be comfortable, to have friends and to have groups that they work with. There is active mentoring of students and so on. But with action, it is actually possible. It's not as impossible as people think. I mean, I looked at the numbers. I was really surprised that people, young women and men all graduate at roughly the same rate. And students from our underrepresented groups even graduate at the same rate as men, and in fact do better in some courses. So this is really pretty amazing.
Great.
We have affinity groups where you have organizations that are centered around ethnicities. It's like and they're partnered with an executive sponsor, high level executive, and I happen to be an executive sponsor for Black employees. We have Unidos, for Latinos, we have, the Asian and the LGBT, BT, and, women of Warner. So it covers the gamut. And what they do is they put on panels and mixers and stuff just to get their culture and their ideas out there, and also, expose, their core group to other high-level executives within the company as well. So.
I think our turnover rates are equal for men and women, so I don't feel like we're more leaky with females than males. But I will use your question as an opportunity to say that we have a social media data analyst role available. I think it would be one of the coolest roles, very math and statistics driven, and I would love it if somebody in this room applied. It's really going to be a cool, fun job.
Awesome. Great. Where would they go to?
Come talk to Rachel or Hillary.
There you go. Okay. Well, I just want to thank the panelists. You guys get a just warm hand up. Applause. Okay. What we're going to do now is we're going to close the program in just a few minutes. We have a reception after this, but before we close the program, we really want to hear, just get some feedback from what you experienced today so that we know how the conference has impacted you and what you've learned from the conference. So Jamie Sekou is going to come up and she's going to do a poll. But the panelists, you're free to go. Thank you again.
Let's give a hand of applause to our amazing panelists.